Well, great to see everybody here. I'm Nikki. I am the Skills Director at Vineskills, and I help coordinate the clients that come in with discovery calls, as well as identifying the best optimizer to help you in your optimization journey here with Filevine. Super excited to be here today. And Val, all yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm Val. I am fairly new to the Vineskills team. This is my first free help, but I'm very, very excited. I am a certified Filevine nerd. There is very little in the world that I like more than talking about Filevine and all the things that it does. So this is a great place for me to be. I worked at a law firm for 2.5 years. I built a lot of deadline chains. I've seen a lot of deadline chains fail and be very ineffective. So I'm really excited to start talking to you guys about all the different ways that we can use them.
Awesome. Thanks. So Jasmine, how do you want to kick this off? You let us know where we go. You're a mute. Yep.
Thanks, I got the little banner, sorry. If one of you wants to share your screen in the sandbox, we can kind of get started. We'll go over just like how-tos on the back end. If you have questions on how to generate or run these items in the front end, we can definitely also go over that. And then again, if you have any particular questions, definitely feel free to ask. There are a few items that are connected to deadline chains and task flows that you'll need to do before you can actually dive into creating those items. And so we'll dive into all of that as well. If you are an admin, a Filevine admin at your firm, you should have advanced access, or you may not. Most of these items, to create them, have to be done in that advanced tab, but anybody, once they've been created, is able to run those on the front end. So we'll go through both so that you can see, and then again, any questions, feel free to use that Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Jasmine. And yes, you do have to have advanced access to be able to create or edit deadline chains. It's usually a really big part of launching a client inside of Filevine, because every firm kind of has their own way of tracking what all of those deadlines look like, different kinds of reminders, whose calendars do you want them to be on, etc. So just to give you a peek behind the curtain of what it looks like when you're building a deadline chain, we're in our advanced tool right now. And I really like coming into the advanced tool when I need to evaluate deadline chains, because it's a much more palatable page for us to look at. You can see the name of every deadline that's coming up, and you can expand them to see what the actual details are. So this one, litigation chain Connecticut, is one of the ones that I really like a lot because it's got a lot in it. I'm going to come into my project here, and I'm in my deadline chains, and I can't see the litigation deadline chain. It's not because I can't, I just have to add it in. So this is something that is pretty easy to do on the user end of things if you're not an admin. All you have to do is click on this plus button, and I'm going to search for it already here and add it. So now I've got my litigation chain, but it looks crazy, right? Because there's only one thing in it, but we know that it's got a bunch of things in it. This is one of the features of a deadline chain that I really enjoy, because it helps us to manage what we're looking at. I don't necessarily at this point in time need to be looking all the way down here at defendant's response to complaint. Probably not where we're starting. We've got all of these things to happen first. This is where we come in and put our due date. So let's just say that this is due like August 1st. And now we've got a whole bunch of things populating. This isn't a default, this is an option. You can totally have your deadline chain show up with every single thing that's in it so that you've got that bird's eye view of what's coming up. I personally really, really like this option to keep it parsed down and itemized on what our focus is right now. The other best thing about a deadline chain, when you populate these extra deadlines, it's giving you what that due date is, because it's already calculating it based on what you have decided the next due date should be. And you can use this in a lot of different ways. If something happens and you know that 30 days after that, the next thing happens, you don't have to do that math yourself. Filevine does it for you. And we love that, because who has time for math? Not me. I'm going to pause for a second and see if we've got anything in the Q&A.
No questions right now.
Excellent.
I will say, as you go in to name your deadline chains, you'll want to make it something that folks are going to know, right? Val is able to say, hey, I know that I'm looking to do something in litigation. Let me type that in and it can populate. If you put something that maybe makes sense to you, but not everybody else, it's going to be difficult for them to actually run the deadline chain that's associated with that.
One example of where that comes up a lot is different SOL chains. So depending on the case types that you have and how many case types you have, it's very likely you're going to have multiple deadline chains. The easiest example is if you've got a client who is a minor, that SOL obviously looks very different from any of the rest of them. So having that accuracy and readability in that deadline chain is so important, because obviously that's not something that we want to get wrong. So in this chain, I am going to pretend that I am extremely ahead of the game, and I'm going to mark a bunch of these complete. So got that done today. Great job. Got that done today. Amazing. We're killing it, Val. Killing it. So I'm going to come up here to these little buttons, and these little buttons are very helpful. This is a long page. The more you add, the longer it gets. I'm going to switch this to this not filled in button, and I'm only going to show the incomplete deadlines. So again, this is filtering our view. What do we actually want to look at while we're accessing this deadline chain? Right now, I just want to see, what have we not done yet? What's coming up? I'm not super worried about what we already did. We can look at those deadlines some other day when we want to evaluate productivity, maybe. Right now, I'm just looking at what's ahead. This is very similar to using a filter in your activity feed or in your task feed to only see incomplete things. When you go into your activity feed, you can see all of the tasks if you want to. Most of the time, we're looking at the incomplete ones. And this is a feature that I think a lot of people sleep on a little bit. It's right here for you, especially in your long deadlines. It's very, very helpful. And if you want to, you can certainly go the other way. Show me only the things that have been done. The default will always be all. And the default sort is always going to be by due date. It makes sense. It's what we expect. If you want to, for some reason, you can sort it by name. You know, if you hypothetically have a deadline chain that has, I don't know, 40 deadlines in it, and you want to bring up only the things that start with client, because those are all your client meetings that you have scheduled. That is a scenario where you might want to sort by name instead of by date. It is atypical, but it's an option there for you. And then the completed date is one that I enjoy for atypical deadline chains when you're looking at how quickly something is moving. Good example of this would be if you've got a lot of discovery going on and you split it into chunks. When did we finish this set? I need to go back to my call logs. When did we finish this set? I need to reference the email exchange that I had with the client. So the completed date can serve really, really, really helpful functions if you use it. But again, it's very, very, very nuanced and not a regular use case. I'm going to pause again.
No questions so far. You're doing a great job.
Thank you. Mostly I'm talking fast. So back to our
And actually, it's a really good nuance though, Val, because I have never actually used those filters to sort. So I will definitely have to pay more attention to those because you can really drill down to what you're looking for. So yes. Nice call out.
I am a sucker for filters. I really, really love it. But I'm an Excel nerd. Data is what I do. So any different version of looking at data is always going to excite me. So the next thing that I want to point out, we're looking at this litigation chain. The litigation chain is really, really important, but we've got other deadline chains that we still need to reference. These are very important for us to retain, and it looks like they're invisible. Before I added this deadline chain, and we had a different one, which is now gone. It's not actually gone, it's just hidden. And this is really, really important to know, especially if you've got your SOL chains separate from the rest of your deadline chains, which is pretty usual. To get your deadline chain back, just come up here and this drop down is automatically going to generate what you already have live in the project. Do not use the plus sign because it's going to ask you to make a new one. Just click in here. And again, if you've got a whole bunch of them, you can type into search, but it's going to populate for you automatically. So I'm going to switch back to arbitration. California, and we're good to go. This is one that I've done in a lot of one-off trainings with like support staff, because they can see all of the dates in their calendar, but the deadline chain has disappeared. It's there, you just have to call it back. So I'm gonna go back to my litigation chain because it's my favorite. There are a few really wonderful things about deadline chains that make them so useful, which is why they're such a popular feature. Number one, which is probably the most obvious, is all of these deadlines are going to go into your project calendar. Of course, as it should. We want them to. Maybe you can choose whether or not they will be in the calendar. And this is wonderful. When you have a deadline chain this long with like 40 things coming up in the next 3 months, your calendar can get really overwhelming really fast. And this is where our advanced access comes in. So right in here, return date, we can see we've got that option to hide it in calendars. A lot of these you're going to want in your calendar because it's a very important thing that you need to have itemized. Looking at the week ahead, this is a very important day. I've got 7 motions due. We're going to focus on those. But not everything in a deadline chain is necessarily a calendar-worthy event. It's just something that you want a reminder for in your workflow. So by default, all of them are going to show up on your calendar. When you've got these really long ones, take a minute to evaluate what your workflow looks like and actually look at your calendar and see what your calendar looks like, because the option isn't a necessity. If it doesn't make sense to be on your calendar, don't feel pressured to do it just because it is a date. We don't need that. Truly, we don't need that. For the ones that do show up on your calendar, let's go. Duplicate. Where's my calendar? All right, so first up is this motion to dismiss filed deadline. August 31st, 2024. August 31st, 2024. 2 more. We got a lot of stuff going on here, but it's showing you this deadline. It's also going to show you what project it is, which is a little bit redundant because that's the project that we're in. That'll be helpful later, and what day it is. So, important thing to know about a deadline chain calendar event. That's all of it. There's nothing else you can do here. You can't add a person to it. You can't add time to it. It is just a thing on a day, period. There is no customizing of the calendar events, and that trips people up a lot. So it's something that you should 100% be aware of. If you do need more information in that deadline, you use this notes section. I've seen, let's see, applicable rules often comes up. You can put in notes if it's, maybe a discovery deadline, if it's a client who's a minor SOL, you can put in the details of their birthday, how long it's been since they've been a client, things like that, especially for your due dates that are going to be really far out, like 6 months away, so that you don't have to come back and think, oh, okay, what were all the things that I needed to do here? The notes is really, really helpful for deadline chains because, again, that's all you get. So use your notes really, really well. For those who don't know, I'm just going to keep having like 17 tabs. In your user calendar, you get the calendar events of all of your projects. So again, evaluate your workflow. What do you actually want your calendar to look like? Right here, just in our Black Panther case, which is, obviously very high profile, we've got a little bit going on. It's not crazy, it's not intense, it's not insane, but on this day alone, we have so many things. So now multiply this by, let's say I've got 40 cases. It gets ridiculous. It gets really unmanageable. Over communication is counterproductive. So at some point, generally, I would recommend like maybe every 6 months, sit down, have a team meeting. What's working here and what's not working here? The firm that I worked at, we literally did this about once every 6 months, just reevaluating the way that our calendars were working. Because obviously, as we all know, it's not just me, it's me contributing in my team, in my department. Everybody working together to make sure that we're actually meeting these deadlines, not just memorializing them. It has to work. So all of these in my project calendar are also going to be in my user calendar with all of my other deadlines. Keep in mind that it's not just deadline chains, it's also your one-off deadlines. It's also your deadlines with reminders, and it's also any events that you put in outside of those three things. And this is why I really, really like talking about deadline chains and deadlines, because there's a lot of ways to accomplish your actual goal, but it's also very much a trap to get really far away from your goal because there's so many options and so many things that can happen. Deadline chains are super popular because of all of these automatic features that it offers you. It might not be the best thing for what you're trying to do. I'm going to pause again. I said a lot of words.
One thing to note is that in your global calendar, the one that shows all of your cases, you do have to toggle deadlines on the very first time in order for those deadlines to show. And then deadlines that are marked as done won't show on that global calendar, but they will still show on your project calendar. So that individual calendar noted, like it'll say done in parentheses. So you can still see that those dates have been accomplished in the individual calendar, but again, that global calendar does have some additional items that you'll have to check. And you can change the view on both calendars so that if you do have, you know, what was it, 6 events in one day, instead of trying to make it bigger, you can put it in a list view or something like that. So you're able to see it a little bit easier.
A+ pro tips. Thank you, Jasmine. For what it's worth, I literally only ever look at my calendar in list view. Just by default, every calendar across my life. It just is better for me.
Especially the global calendar, because as you
Oh
start not only the deadlines across all your projects, but then you have other folks in your firm's calendars on there. It becomes to be a lot of dates that are really difficult to see if you're in that month view. Once you change it once, it should be sticky, so you shouldn't have to go in and like refilter every time. But again, the first time that you're in any of those spaces, you'll have to at least click those things.
Perf. We love calendars. I love calendars. I love organizing. I'm a nerd. So next option in a deadline chain that I want to talk about is dependent on another deadline. So we saw this in the very first step that I did in our litigation chain. We couldn't see any of these things until motion to dismiss filed had that due date. So if we look down here at Marshall's return of service date, this is dependent on the return date when it gets a due date. When it's filled in, it makes a lot of sense. Going backwards and building it can take a lot of trial and error because the syntax of these prompts is a little bit crazy. It took me a lot of like test deadline chains to be able to immediately know how to get it to do what I wanted to do. So I will just throw out there, if you're having trouble or you've never done it before, just expect to crash and burn a little bit because it's not super obvious right away. We fail to succeed, and I support that. It's very healthy. So the dependencies. If you want it to be dependent, meaning if you want it to be hidden until something else happens, you just check it off, easy peas, and you decide what is the thing that allows this to be seen. In this instance, we don't want to look at the Marshall's return of service date at all under any circumstances until we have a due date on this return date. It's not relevant. Don't bring it up. Keep it off my radar forever. So once we've got that due date set for the return date, this deadline now becomes visible. Not only does it become visible, but we're automatically putting in the due date. The due date is going to be 20 days earlier. It's hard to read out loud because I read it differently in my head, like the Matrix. So we'll start left to right. 20 number, easy. How many days? Alternatively, weeks, months, years, depending on obviously how long this process is going to take. This one trips people up a lot. It's asking you what kind of counting of days you want to do. Count every day is going to include your weekends. Judicial calendar is something that you can set up in a different advanced tool. jurisdiction calendars should only be done by somebody who really, really knows them. Have your reference material next to you because it's really easy to get wrong, especially if you're not paying attention to the changes year over year. And these ones, this is a couple of custom ones. I don't actually know what they are, but the point is when you go into your calendar setup, you can set very, very specific calendar types. A lot of things that we're doing, we're not counting those weekends. A lot of things that we're doing, we're not counting federal holidays. If it's court related, we're skipping those days, they don't count. So that is what that drop down is. What calendar are you using to count your deadlines? Business days, every day, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say you'll want to make sure that you do that step before you come in to create your deadline chains so you're not having to do double the work. You can create as many judicial calendars as you need, and they'll automatically have those weekends and federal holidays blocked out. Any other date that you need to select, you'll have to do that for each year. So if you've selected it in 2024, when you click to 2025 in the calendar, you'll have to reselect those dates. So for instance, if you're like, hey, our office is off the entire last week from Christmas to New Year's, we obviously don't want any deadlines popping up. You're going to have to select that time frame for each year that is a time frame that you don't want to be shown.
And it is definitely an investment. Again, this is another one. It's not just a casual thing that you do. Make time for it, sit down and have a team discussion because it does get a little bit in the weeds when you're in there. But once we know how we're counting our days, what calendar we're using to count our days, you have the option of earlier or later. It's asking you how many days in reference to the thing that happened here. Mostly I'm going to say, just play with it. We're going to make a fake one so that you can see the difference when we change it. But I mean, you can see how hard it is for me to say it out loud because I read it backwards when I'm doing it. So we're going to do a quick one, but I want to show you the rest of these. So your reminder schedule, again, this is an advanced tool that you set up beforehand. You've got your default from Filevine. The reminder schedule is how often do we want to remind you that this deadline is coming up? I have seen maybe like once where somebody made a no deadline reminder. It's an interesting idea, but the reminders is one of the main reasons that people enjoy the deadline chains because it is giving you that heads up. So you don't have to constantly check your calendar to know that it's coming. It's going to tell you in your project and in your email if you have that notification setting on that you've got 180 days, 60 days, 30 days, etc. until this deadline is coming. Most firms that I have looked at have a lot of reminder schedules because it really depends on what the deadline type is. If you've got a minor's birthday, 18th birthday, and it's not going to happen for another 7 years, you don't need to be reminded of that every month. Nobody needs that. So you make very specific things based on what that deadline is. Best practice is always to have a very easy to read descriptor. So when I'm looking at this, I immediately know that this reminder schedule is giving me these dates, these amounts of dates before the due date. Very clear, very easy. If I come here, -7, -2, 0, 2, 7. This is just a different syntax. Personally, I like this one better because actually I do really like math. So 7 days before, 2 days before, on the day, 2 after, 7 after. This is more readable for people who do not read a negative as before, and I support that. These ones down here are a little bit difficult for me. 30-day reminder, I'm going to guess, means that there's going to be one reminder 30 days before, but that might be wrong. I don't know. I would have to go into my advanced tool and check it to make sure. So this is always going to be the best practice that we are suggesting. If you guys as a team decide on a naming convention that looks more like this, totally fine, as long as you have that SOP written out for people who come in and have the question, does this just mean one day? So you set your reminder schedule. You can put a URL if you want to. I have yet to see anybody who does that regularly. But again, it's like your notes. parent date, subsequent date, trigger. That's super helpful. That's a great note. I love this note. I live for this note because it's telling anybody who comes into this advanced tool what's happening without having to do all of the research of watching all the things happen. I'm going to pause again really fast before we make a fake deadline.
Still no questions. You're doing a great job.
Amazing.
Yeah, and I think it's good to note that trigger of completed date. Just an FYI, if you do not put a completed date, you'll continue to get reminders. So if you have a long reminder schedule and you don't put a done date, you're going to keep getting reminders that that deadline is coming up, even if you've already done it. Again, that done date is what signifies the system to let them know you don't need any reminders. And also in some deadline chains will trigger additional deadlines. Such
a good tip. I watched somebody almost have a nervous breakdown over a never-ending reminder. They're like, it's over. It's over. Like, does it know though? Did you tell the computer though? Because the computer has very specific instructions.
Yeah, that end date is important.
I wanted to show you one other thing. Not that, this eyeball. One issue that I have with Filevine is backwards buttons. So this is an eyeball with a line through it, and it's asking me in that hover text to unpublish it. Personally, when I look at an eyeball with a line through it, I interpret that as nobody can see this. What it's actually saying is, if you click on me, nobody can see this anymore. Really easy trap to fall for, and I've done it a bunch. I have the same issue with the check mark and X on tasks. I take it very personally. I don't love it, but we've accepted it. It is what it is. Backwards eyeball. So we're going to make a new deadline chain. Add new, and I'm going to name this Val trains everyone. Default calendar behavior, count every day. I'm not here for it. Let's go with new calendar 2024, which again, I don't know what it is. We're going to find out together. I'm excited. I'm not going to select a jurisdiction, obviously. Annoying. This is the best. Okay, here we go. Set the foundation, ready to start. Now we've got nothing. Nothing's happening. That's okay. It's a fresh start, and I'm here for you. We start with the deadline. What are we going to make it? My new deadline is open Zoom meeting. Is this dependent on another deadline? No, it's the first one. That would be crazy. Am I going to hide it in my calendar? No, I need that reminder. Val, don't forget to open Zoom, or there is no training. That would be crazy. Reminder schedule, I'm going to pick my favorite 180, 120. I'm giving myself a lot of notice for this training that I want to be prepared because it's important to me. I'm not going to add in the URL because I don't need one. My notes are going to be check calendar or link because I'm so prepared that I put that link in my calendar 180 days before this training started. Amazing. It's not true. We're going to pretend. So I've got my first deadline. This is very exciting. We love it. What's the thing that's going to happen after I open the Zoom meeting? I'm going to pretend that the next thing that happens is 7 days later, we will begin the training. Don't worry, we've got an unlimited subscription on Zoom. It's going to be a long recording, but I think everybody's really going to benefit from it. So we're going to add a deadline. Start training. I'm going to make this one dependent because I don't care about it until I open Zoom. I don't need to be reminded that I need to start a meeting in a Zoom that isn't open. That's not helpful to me. So it's going to be dependent on another deadline, which is obviously my only option. When this gets completed, I will see this. I could set it to do, like once I tell myself I'm going to be opening a Zoom meeting on this day, then I can give myself the heads up 7 days later, this is going to happen. But I don't really care. Personally, I don't care. I don't want to see it until I know that the Zoom is open. So once that's completed, I'm going to set this to 7 days default later. Round 2 prior day instead of next day. No, thank you. Keep my same reminder schedule. Don't forget to hydrate because I'm talking a lot. Okay, we're going to start simple. 2 things, easy peas. First of all, I'm going to come to this eyeball, which looks like that means that this is visible, but actually is meaning that it is invisible, and I'm going to click it. If I don't click the eyeball and put the line through it, nobody can use this deadline chain. It's just sitting here waiting for its moment. So we're going to publish it, come back to Black Panther, and refresh. New deadline chain. Val trains everyone. Oh my God, we're so excited. Okay, so as expected, we can only see one thing. Open Zoom meeting. Nothing else is going to happen because I have very specifically told the computer I don't want anything to happen right now. I'm going to put in my due date for next Wednesday. And still nothing happens, but it is telling me you've got 7 days to go until this due date. Thank you, Filevine. That's very helpful. Let's say that again, I'm a total overachiever and I decided I really want to get ahead of the game. I'm going to open my Zoom meeting today and give myself tons of time to prepare. Start training pops right up. 9 days to go. Amazing. Here's our 7-day calculation that we did not have to do ourselves. I'm going to have Zoom open for 7 days. I'm going to get reminders based on the schedule that I laid out. And then it's going to be time for me to start the training. And it's going to be great because I'm going to know well ahead of time that it's coming. And that's how you make a deadline chain. And then you just keep going. I'm going to pause again for questions.
I will say that the little I next to the words are those wonderful notes that Val put in. So unlike the ones that you can see in the calendar that automatically pop up when you go in, you do have to click on the I to see the notes that are put in on the back end, but they are there.
Mm-hmm.
And you can always add your own notes again to those ones if you need.
All right, perf. How are we doing? We're doing great. All right, we're going to add something very tricky, and that is a group. I really like groups, but again, it's a thing that you take a lot of time to do, and you do a lot of tests before you actually commit to it. One of the things that for me is the most fun about tools like deadline chains is how much I get to play with it to find out all of the different things that it does, which is so many things. You can make a really easy, straightforward deadline chain without a lot of effort and without a lot of knowledge. I think it is very much worth the investment to find out all of the different ways that you can use it in creative ways that you maybe have never considered before, because there's a lot of possibilities. But ultimately, that's the foundation of Filevine anyway. So many possibilities. So let's make a group. My group is going to be training agenda. This is going to be dependent on another deadline, which is start training. And this one, I'm going to say when it gets a due date, because once I've started the training, I want to know what every single one of these deadlines is. Set group due date to 1 day later. Save it. Now, in my group, I'm going to make a bunch of little deadlines. So in this case, we'll go back to the beginning. I set myself a deadline to open Zoom, make sure Zoom works. 7 days later, start the training. Inside of the training, I am going to have an agenda. This training session is one individual thing that I need on my calendar. Within this one individual thing, I've got very specific stuff that's going to happen. I don't need to see my agenda if I never actually open Zoom. If Zoom never happens, if training never happens, none of these agenda items are of any relevance to me. So they are in a group and they're hidden until we need them. Deadline number 1, introductions. And we're going to start this 1 day later. It's a long training session, guys. Save. I did not put a reminder on that. I don't need reminders while I'm in here. It's very distracting. That's why we have Teams. Add another deadline. Show advanced tool. Also 1 day. Etc. And so on and so on and so on. So one of the reasons that it's really helpful to look at your entire deadline chain within your advanced tool is because when you minimize it, we've got our big ones that we're already very familiar with. And then within this training agenda, you can see all the individual stuff inside it. So this isn't showing me what the visibility is. You know, it's not telling me that all of this is going to be hidden until you do this thing, but you can at least see that I've got this one group of things that I'm only going to see if something else happens. You do then have to go in and check to see what those things are, but it's a really, really nice visual. Think of it as like looking at an outline for a paper-ish. So let's come back to Black Panther. We're going to refresh. Okay. Start training. I'm doing amazing. My training is done. This isn't doing anything, which is terribly embarrassing. I'm going to refresh again. Hang on. Minute completed. When it gets to due date, do you want me to take the due date away? Because I can do that. There we go. Just wanted me to start over. Fine. So I put in my due date for my introductions, and then my new task, my new deadlines that are in my group generated the way that I told it to generate them. It's not typical that that would happen because you're not usually going to go back and delete a deadline and then add new things to it. But there's a pro tip for us all. If you add new deadlines to a deadline chain and it's dependent on a due date, you have to take the due date off to make it work again. Fun fact, this is very similar to Taskflows. Sometimes you cannot get a Taskflow to reset and actually do things if there are still outstanding tasks. Learned that the hard way with my medical records specialist. Pro tips from Val. So one thing to note, within your actual deadline chain section in your project, it's not showing me that these are groups, grouped deadlines within a deadline, but it's not really something that a front end user needs to know. It's going to populate the way you want it to. It's going to work the way you want it to in the workflow that you've already discussed at length with your team, hypothetically. So it's fine. All of our org admins, our advanced users, our customs editor builders, you guys are the ones who need to know the ins and outs of what is a group and what is not a group, because it's really going to impact any changes that you make. But for the most part, everybody just gets the deadlines that they need to get so that they can do their jobs very, very well. I'm going to pause again for questions.
You are killing it because there are no questions so far.
Yeah, and I know we're close to time, so not sure if you have other stuff to go over for deadline chains, but if we could hop into Taskflows at least for just a little bit.
Taskflows are my next favorite thing. Also, such an investment. There are two things to know about Taskflows before you know anything else. Oh God, let's go PI. There are two triggers, phases or action buttons. We all know what a phase is. That's a thing in the top right that tells you what the status of your case is. And then your action buttons are the little things that you actually click on. It usually says something like activate task flow, start task flow, etc. So when you look at your phases, I think pretty much everybody starts with a fairly standard set of phase-based task flows. Really just depends on what your org looks like, what your practice groups look like, certainly, what your intake process looks like and how much of that is in Filevine, things to think about. Ultimately, in your head, as you're building them and working through them and possibly cleaning them up because you have a bunch of stuff that doesn't work, think about what is going to be the same for every case that is in that phase, what is always going to be the same, or maybe like 5 exceptions. If it's very specific to one type of case, it should not be a phase-based task flow because it doesn't make sense for most of your cases. Action buttons are limited to a section. So these are fields that we put in our customs editor. You specifically go in, you make the widget, it's an action button, hooray. So it's always going to ask you what section you're looking at. It's only going to give you the option of a section if you have already created it in the customs editor. Fun fact, Filevine had to teach that to me because I couldn't figure out how to add a task flow. You have to make the field in the customs editor first, and then you can come and create the task flow. With the phases, you don't have to do that. I mean, you have to have the phase to be able to make it. So we can say it's the same. So let's look at what we've got in case summary. Litigation review request just has the one task. So somebody's going to come in to their case summary. They're going to click on this button, and this is what happens. The task shows up in our activity feed. Litigation review needs to be reviewed. And then we've got some replacement fields in here, which is just my favorite thing to do. Replacement fields will work just like a docgen or an email template, etc. It's going to pull in the data that is inside of that field. I have used this for tons of things. Check request is a really big one that I use it for, so that whoever's printing that check doesn't have to go all the way back and figure out who they're paying this money to. They already have it right there in their email. It's wonderful. So we've got replacement codes. We've got some formatting in here. We love making things bold or big or purple. My favorite, obviously. And then you choose when this happens. Because there's only one task in here, you're going to make it when you click the button. If you have multiple tasks, just like our deadlines, you can make that contingent. We're not going to see this task until this one gets done, etc. It gets very complicated and very fun. So when do we want to create it? We want to create it immediately. 0 days means as soon as I click this button, the task exists. You can push that out if you want to. Use case scenario. Case is settled, case has been fully distributed. We know that all of our checks have cleared, everything is good, but we're still going to hold it just in case. And then 30 days from when all of the tasks have been completed, we create a new task for our case manager. Everything's good. We can close this file now. Give yourself a little bit of a buffer. We don't need that task sitting there for 30 days, making our case manager look like she's not getting any of her work done. We're just going to wait to give it to her when she needs it. All task flows, regardless of whether or not it's a phase-based or an action button-based, is going to be assigned to a role. And this one's a little bit difficult for people sometimes. You can't pick a person, but you can make the person the only one who has that role. If it is assigned to a role that nobody has in that project, it's automatically going to go to your primary. Very important here. So use case scenario again. I did a lot of accounting at the firm that I worked at, so I use that reference a lot. But for instance, you can assign an automatic task to your accounting department, whoever has the accounting role, to print a check. You need a check, you put in the request, that goes to accounting. It makes sense. But let's say in Black Panther, we didn't have anybody who was assigned the accounting role when this project was created. That task is instead going to go to the primary, who has to decide whose job this is. Either accounting should have been in the project and they just weren't added correctly, or accounting doesn't actually have access to this and somebody else is going to have to take care of this check. So think about who your primary is, and if you want them to be the person responsible for deciding where tasks should go. This was a very great debate in 2 firms that I know of, whether or not the primary should be the lead attorney or the paralegal. It was both ways. 1-1 with the paralegals and 1-1 with the lead attorney. The one where the paralegals won was because of this reason. When a task that has no role comes up to the primary, the lead attorney just goes to the paralegal and says, hey, what should I do with this? So very important. And if you have your lead attorneys as your primaries and they get a bunch of tasks assigned to them that they don't understand, 100% it's because there are tasks going to a role that has not been assigned.
And typically the primary is whoever created the project, unless you've changed it manually in the system. So just note that. And then as far as the replacement codes, at the very top of this window, there's a question mark. That's where you'll get the list of available replacement codes. Anytime you see the ability for you to click an available list for replacement codes, you'll want to do that because the fields do change slightly depending on which section you're in, and they will vary if you're like in DocGens versus Taskflows versus Customs Editor. They have some that are consistent, but depending on which section you're in, they do vary. So you'll want to make sure, just best practice, generate a new list every time you see it so that you know that the codes that you're utilizing are accurate and will work.
Feels that you can always expect to be a challenge no matter what you're doing is anything in the collection section and anything that's not in the main page of a contact card. You're going to need to check every time. It gets very messy. and it's not going to load. I've got like 17 different Filevine environments open right now, so please forgive my screen for not loading, but the replacement field code list is a lot of fun for me. We'll talk about that a different day. But in your task, you can do a lot of different things. One thing that I have found very, very useful is the also notify roles. So example, let's say we're doing a distribution. The accounting department has mailed out the client's distribution check rather than relying on a bunch of emails or Teams messages, Slack messages, whatever you do, sidebars, perhaps. You can set this to notify other people. So one of the things that I did at my firm, there was a task to accounting, please distribute this check. When accounting marked it complete, there was a new task to the paralegal to inform the client that their check had been mailed. So I also notified the primary attorney in that case so that they would also know without several emails or notes or Teams messages that the client had been mailed their check. And there is a very specific notification that you need to get that notification, which is something that a lot of people do not know. You have to turn it on to be notified in this way, but it is extremely helpful and it really, really streamlines conversations so you don't have to keep tasking things back and forth to people. Pause for questions. I think I'm done.
For the roles, the person that you assign it to or the role that you assign it to is only going to be assigned to one person, even if you have 5 folks listed in that role. If you also notify, it will notify everyone listed in that role. So if you have 5 paralegals and you're also notifying them, all 5 paralegals are able to get that notification. So there's just a few little nuances here and there with the task flows. And then of course, everyone is able to see those tasks in your activity feed. You can manage them from there as well once they've been created. But it doesn't look like there's any questions. You did a phenomenal job, Val. Thank you so much.
We can talk about this all day.
For those of you that are interested, or maybe you're like, hey, deadline chains sounded great. We don't have the capacity to build them out. Or, hey, it's going to be a little bit more complex. And I know that there's a lot of moving pieces. We would love consulting or just help on building those out. We can definitely help with that. We offer different optimization services, and I put that link in the chat. So you can feel free to visit our website to see kind of which option works best for you. And then if you do have any of the other Filevine related products and you need help with that, or just anything in general, definitely feel free to reach out. Again, I put all of our emails in the chat, so feel free to reach out there. And then the last thing, we will be at Lex this year in September. If you all are going, feel free to stop by our table. We'd love to see you all in person. If you haven't bought your ticket and are like, hey, are there any discount codes? Definitely feel free to reach out to us. We can get you a discount code, so it's a little bit cheaper on you all for getting to Lex, but we would love to see you all in person. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Val. Thank you, Nikki. And hopefully we see you all at another free help session.
Thanks, everybody.
Perfect.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Bye-bye.